Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. The year was 1858 when 3 enslaved individuals vanished without trace from Magnolia Hill, the sprawling Beauregard plantation in Baton Rouge. That same morning, Overseer Thomas Whitfield discovered a sealed letter in Master Elijah Beauregard's study, its contents eerily predicting the disappearance. 2 days later, Beauregard himself was found dead, his throat slashed beside a nameless fresh grave in the family cemetery. Authorities quickly blamed runaway slaves, but the truth remained hidden until 1921, when renovations uncovered housemaid Lucinda's secret diary. Its pages revealed a sinister conspiracy, one the Beauregard family had murdered to conceal, a dark secret they'd hoped would stay buried forever beneath the Louisiana soil. Magnolia Hill's imposing white columns had first risen from the fertile Mississippi floodplain in 1823, when François Beauregard, a French immigrant with mysterious connections to Napoleon's fallen regime, acquired the land through a series of transactions later scrutinized by historians for their suspicious nature. Parish records from East Baton Rouge, preserved in the state archives and examined during a 1967 doctoral study, reveal how François transformed a modest parcel into a 1,000-acre empire through marriages, partnerships, and what one contemporary described as dealings of an ambiguous moral character. His son Elijah inherited the estate in 1842. Already a widower at 36 after his wife Charlotte succumbed to what physicians documented merely as a wasting melancholia following childbirth, their infant son having perished the same night. Elijah's subsequent management of Magnolia Hill gained notice among neighboring planters for its unusual practices. Ledgers discovered in a New Orleans bank vault in 1934 showed he purchased primarily skilled workers who could read or possessed knowledge of African spiritual traditions, paying premium prices despite their supposedly diminished physical capacities for fieldwork. The Baton Rouge Gazette, in editions spanning 1845 to 1857, frequently mentioned Elijah among the city's elite, while alluding to his eccentric scholarly pursuits and interest in antiquities of the darker continents. More disturbing were the 7 documented disappearances of travelers, freedmen, and itinerant workers within 5 miles of Magnolia Hill between 1850 and 1857. Cases summarily dismissed by local authorities despite witness accounts describing strange lights among the oak trees and chanting carried on night winds emanating from the direction of the Beauregard property. The morning of the 12th of June, 1858, began with an unusual stillness that Thomas Whitfield, overseer of Magnolia Hill for 7 years, would later describe in his meticulous daily report as a silence that seemed to swallow even the birds' songs. The document, preserved between the pages of a plantation ledger and discovered during a university archive project in 1972, recounts how Whitfield proceeded with his morning inspection at precisely 6 o'clock, moving methodically from the stables toward the workers' quarters that stood in neat rows beyond the kitchen gardens. It was there, according to his handwritten testimony, that he first noticed the absence of 3 individuals: Solomon, a carpenter whose skilled hands had crafted much of the plantation's fine furniture; Isaiah, known for his knowledge of herbs and healing practices brought from his ancestral Gold Coast; and Ruth, a woman whose ability to read had been secretly utilized by Elijah Beauregard for transcribing obscure texts. Most peculiar, Whitfield noted in a section of his report, later partially obscured by what chemical analysis in 1989 would determine to be drops of human blood, is the manner of their departure. No locks broken upon their doors, no personal items missing from their sparse dwellings, no provisions taken for what would surely be a perilous journey. Even more confounding were the grounds surrounding the quarters, which had received a substantial rainfall the previous evening, transforming the paths to mud that should have preserved footprints of any who passed. Yet Whitfield documented not a single impression leading away from their dwellings, as if they had been lifted directly to heaven or descended into the earth itself. The report continues with clinical detachment to describe how Whitfield immediately ordered the remaining workers to search the property while he proceeded to inform Master Beauregard, only to find the plantation owner already seated in his study, a glass of untouched bourbon at his elbow, seemingly unsurprised by the news, and holding a sealed letter that would later become central to the mystery. Most disturbing of all was Whitfield's final observation, struck through with a single line but still legible. The master's sole response upon hearing of their absence was to inquire whether the new moon had risen yet, though we are still 4 nights from its appearance. The sealed letter that Thomas Whitfield observed in Elijah Beauregard's possession that fateful morning would become the subject of intense scrutiny in the decades that followed. Its contents preserved through a fortuitous series of events, beginning with Reverend Matthias Johnston's decision to create a copy before returning the original to Beauregard's desk drawer. This duplicate, discovered among Johnston's personal effects after his death in 1886, bears the distinctive flowing script confirmed by 3 separate handwriting analyses conducted in 1901, 1947, and most recently in 2008, to be that of Elijah Beauregard himself, with the curious detail that the ink contained traces of an organic compound later identified as human blood, specifically blood matching Beauregard's own rare type. Dated the 27th of April 1858, nearly 6 weeks before the disappearances. The letter begins with an invocation in what linguistic experts from Tulane University eventually identified as a corrupted form of Dahomean ritual language before transitioning to English. When the summer moon hangs full, 3 souls will depart without leaving trace, their absence the first tremor before the earth opens beneath my feet. More disturbing are the middle passages, where Beauregard writes of a debt 15 years in the coming due, and payment demanded in blood that cannot be substituted, followed by specific references to Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth as vessels chosen not by my hand, but by forces that have watched from the shadows of the swamp since before white men claimed these lands. The margins of the letter contain intricate symbols resembling those found on certain artifacts recovered from slave quarters throughout the lower Mississippi region, symbols associated with secret practices maintained despite planters' attempts to eradicate African spiritual traditions. Most telling was Beauregard's decision to summon Reverend Johnston to Magnolia Hill immediately after Whitfield's report of the disappearances, though parish records indicate Johnston was not his family's regular spiritual advisor. The Reverend's own journal, maintained daily for 47 years, contains a disturbing entry from June 12, describing his arrival at the plantation to find Beauregard pale as death itself, clutching the letter as if it were both salvation and damnation, and requesting not prayers or counsel, but rather instruction in what rituals might protect a man whose bargain has soured and whose creditors now come to collect what he most values. The discovery of Elijah Beauregard's body on the morning of the 14th of June, 1858, was made by groundskeeper William Perkins, who had been instructed to prepare a burial plot for reasons Whitfield's log cryptically described as anticipatory measures requested by the master himself. Perkins's sworn statement, recorded by Sheriff James Harrington and preserved in parish judicial archives, recounts how he found Beauregard sprawled beside a freshly excavated grave in the family cemetery, where generations of Beauregards lay beneath marble headstones imported from France. This new plot distinguished by its complete absence of marking or identification. The coroner's examination, documented with unusual thoroughness for that era by Dr. Thaddeus Morgan, noted that the fatal wound across Beauregard's throat exhibited several anomalous characteristics that defied conventional explanation. The laceration appears to have been executed with surgical precision, yet no known blade could create such a wound, as the edges show evidence of both cutting and burning simultaneously, as if the implement were both knife and flame. More perplexing still were Dr. Morgan's observations regarding the blood pattern surrounding the body, which he described as forming symbols of deliberate design rather than random pooling, alongside his notation that despite the catastrophic wound, The deceased's expression betrays not terror but a profound relief. The subsequent official investigation, spanning a mere 36 hours before reaching its conclusion, focused exclusively on the 3 missing enslaved individuals, with Sheriff Harrington declaring in the Baton Rouge Gazette on June 16 that the violent murder of Mr. Beauregard by his ungrateful servants represents the gravest danger our society faces. Reward notices appeared throughout Louisiana and neighboring states, offering unprecedented sums for the capture of Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth, described as dangerous conspirators possessed of unnatural cunning and malevolence toward their betters. The parish militia, augmented by volunteer posts from surrounding plantations, fanned out across the region with bloodhounds and firearms, their search extending to river ports and known routes of the so-called Underground Railroad. Yet no credible sightings would ever be recorded despite the considerable bounty. Most curious was the discovery made by Dr. Morgan's assistant during preparation of Beauregard's body for burial. Clutched in the deceased's right hand was a small leather pouch containing 3 locks of hair, each of different texture and color, labeled in Beauregard's handwriting with the names of the missing individuals. Sheriff William Hargrove's investigation into Elijah Beauregard's murder proceeded with a swiftness that later historians would find suspicious, particularly in light of financial ledgers uncovered during a 1932 courthouse renovation revealing Hargrove's substantial debts to Beauregard's shipping interests, a side venture that had quadrupled the plantation owner's already considerable fortune. The investigation files, partially destroyed in an 1887 courthouse fire but reconstructed through newspaper accounts and correspondence, show Hargrove devoted the majority of resources to the manhunt while relegating contradictory evidence to perfunctory footnotes in his official report. Most telling was a telegram discovered in 1976 among the personal effects of Deputy James Moreau, sent by Hargrove to the governor's office on June 17, dismissing concerns about inconsistencies in the physical evidence and explicitly requesting that certain witness testimonies be excluded from official documentation as they represent superstitious fantasies that undermine public confidence in our conclusions. These excluded statements, preserved only because Clerk Thomas Whitaker secretly transcribed them before their ordered destruction, included accounts from 5 workers from neighboring plantations who independently reported witnessing strange blue lights moving among the tombstones in the Beauregard family cemetery on the 3 consecutive nights preceding the murder. Particularly detailed was the testimony of Harriet Jenkins, a laundress from the adjacent Wilson plantation, who described hearing voices chanting in no language of this earth and observing 3 figures in white moving in circular patterns around what appeared to be Mr. Beauregard himself, kneeling at the center of their formation. Sheriff Hargrove's selective approach extended to physical evidence as well, with his official report making no mention of the intricate symbols found carved into the oak tree overlooking the empty grave, symbols that local historian Amelia Lafayette would later identify in an 1891 monograph as consistent with West African protective sigils designed to bind malevolent spirits to their proper realm. Most damning to Hargrove's official narrative was a journal entry written by Reverend Johnston describing a private conversation with the sheriff just hours after the discovery of Beauregard's body, during which Hargrove allegedly stated, "Some horrors must remain buried for the stability of our society, even if truth becomes their casualty. Beauregard knew the risks of his arrangements, and now we must ensure the consequences remain hidden." Cornelius Beauregard arrived at Magnolia Hill on the 27th of June, 1858, having journeyed from Boston upon receiving news of his uncle's death. His status as sole heir confirmed through legal documents that one Louisiana judge described as unusually specific in their provisions and restrictions. A portrait preserved in the Louisiana State Museum shows a young man of 30 with the family's characteristic pale blue eyes and aquiline features, though his countenance appears more scholarly than suited to plantation management, an impression confirmed by his Harvard education in classical languages and antiquities. The collection of 15 letters Cornelius wrote to his colleague Professor William Thorndike between July and November 1858, discovered in Harvard's archives during a 1952 cataloging project, reveal his progressive dismay as he delved deeper into his uncle's affairs. The earliest correspondence expresses bewilderment. Uncle Elijah's business dealings extend far beyond agriculture into realms I scarcely comprehend. Vessels sailing to ports no reputable merchant would acknowledge, expenditures for artifacts described in ledgers only by cryptic symbols, and payments to individuals identified solely by initials, some residing in Haiti and Dahomey. By September, Cornelius's letters betray growing horror, particularly following his discovery of what he describes as a hidden study, accessible only through a mechanism concealed behind the library's northernmost bookcase, containing journals that document arrangements so unholy I dare not commit their details even to this private correspondence. Most disturbing was his October letter, which trembles with barely contained panic. I understand now why he met his end as he did, not murdered by those 3 poor souls who vanished, but rather fulfilling a bargain struck 15 years ago when the fever nearly claimed the entire household. A bargain requiring payment when the designated vessels had been properly prepared through rituals I cannot describe. The final letter mentions Cornelius's conviction that he was being watched by something that occupies the shadows of this accursed house, and his decision to burn certain documents, though not before copying those pages which might prove essential, should I too become an unwilling participant in whatever transaction remains incomplete. The existence of Lucinda Williams first emerges in the historical record through Magnolia Hill's property inventories, where she appears in an 1849 document as house girl, age approximately 17. Assigned to master's personal quarters, value exceptional. What distinguished this entry, noted by archivists at Tulane University during a 1983 examination of plantation records, was the unusual annotation in Elijah Beauregard's handwriting. Not to be sold under any circumstances, nor reassigned to field labor regardless of plantation needs. Quarterly expense ledgers revealed further anomalies in Lucinda's treatment. Private tutoring in reading and writing disguised as specialized household training. Access to the plantation library during evening hours, and possession of personal items far exceeding the typical allowances for enslaved individuals, including a writing desk discovered in servants' quarters inventories. Plantation visitor Julia Harrington, wife of a neighboring sugar planter, mentioned Lucinda in her social correspondence from 1853, remarking with evident disapproval that Beauregard permits a colored girl to manage his household correspondence and maintain his private schedule, affording her liberties that upset the proper order of relations. More telling still was Reverend Johnston's journal entry from Christmas 1856, noting that during his pastoral visit, he observed Lucinda, seated not in the servants' quarters, but in the master's library, transcribing texts in languages unknown to me, her facility with the pen suggesting years of practiced literacy. What Lucinda witnessed during her years of intimate access to Beauregard family affairs would remain unrecorded until after emancipation, her position requiring absolute discretion under threat of severe consequences. A silence maintained even during Sheriff Hargrove's cursory questioning following Elijah's murder, where official transcripts show her responses limited to variations of, "I know nothing of the master's business." Yet plantation overseer records indicate that on the night of June 11, 1858, the evening before Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth vanished, Lucinda was observed by night watchman Frederick Jenkins, carrying a small lantern toward the old slave cemetery beyond the North Fields, where she remained for near 2 hours before returning, her face bearing an expression that chilled me more than the night air. The pursuit of Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth continued long after public interest in the Beauregard murder had waned, with reward notices appearing in newspapers as far north as Chicago until 1863, when the chaos of the Civil War finally eclipsed the lingering mystery. and 1,875 compilation of abolitionist records titled The Invisible Passages, Accounts of the Southern Underground, contained a chapter devoted to Louisiana operations, wherein the author, identified only as a former conductor, explicitly stated that, among the hundreds who passed through our network toward freedom, never did we encounter the 3 souls who vanished from Magnolia Hill. Though their descriptions circulated among every station and safe house from New Orleans to Canada, this absence becomes more significant when contextualized against documents discovered during a 1943 renovation of a former freedmen's school in Baton Rouge, hidden beneath floorboards in what historical analysis confirmed was the residence of Marcus Lafayette, a free man of color who had operated as the region's primary underground railroad coordinator between 1845 and 1862. Lafayette's papers, encoded using a substitution cipher that researchers from Tulane University spent 7 months deciphering, contained multiple references to the Beauregard disappearances, including an August 1858 message to collaborators in Mississippi stating, "Inquiries about the 3 from Magnolia Hill must cease. They did not travel our path, but took another route to a different kind of freedom, one not found in northern states, nor offered by any mortal liberator." More enigmatic was Lafayette's journal entry from September 1858, recording a conversation with a woman identified only as L, presumably Lucinda, who allegedly reported that they transcended the bonds not just of servitude but of earthly constraint itself. Passing beyond through the door Beauregard opened with his transactions in blood and soul. Most disturbing was Lafayette's final notation regarding the matter, dated December 1859, where he instructed his network to avoid the old burial grounds beyond Magnolia Hill's northern boundary. Especially at night when the moon hangs full, what walks there may appear familiar in form but is no longer those we once knew, their new master being far less merciful than their former. The Louisiana Central Railroad's expansion through Baton Rouge in the spring of 1901 necessitated the partial relocation of several historic cemeteries, including the long-abandoned Beauregard family plot, which had fallen into disrepair after the plantation's dissolution following the Civil War. Foreman Jackson Thibodeau's daily progress reports, preserved in the company's archives and examined by historians in 1978, document the increasingly disturbed tone with which he recorded the excavation of Elijah Beauregard's grave on the 17th of April 1901. The deceased was interred with items inconsistent with Christian burial traditions. Thibodeau noted, describing small carved figurines of unfamiliar design positioned at the head, feet, and along both sides of the remains, crafted from African blackwood and ivory, their features suggesting ritualistic purpose rather than mere ornamentation. Most significant was his account of a silk bundle placed directly upon Beauregard's chest, the fabric inscribed with symbols that Professor Andrew Livingston of Miskatonic University would later identify in his 1937 comparative analysis of West African religious practices as consistent with Dahomean protective wards, specifically those designed to bind a spirit to its corporeal remains. The excavation took a sinister turn when laborer Thomas Morrison, who had handled the silk-wrapped artifacts, collapsed the following morning, exhibiting symptoms described in the company physician's report as acute fever accompanied by delirium, in which the patient repeatedly screamed about eyes watching from the shadows and hands reaching through from somewhere else. Morrison's death 36 hours later from what the medical examiner deemed cerebral hemorrhage of unknown origin prompted railroad officials to immediately suspend the cemetery relocation, with company president William Hartford issuing a confidential memorandum, later discovered during a 1962 corporate archive transfer, ordering that all items recovered from the Beauregard plot be reinterred. Immediately, the excavation filled without further disturbance, and the rail line rerouted at whatever additional expense necessary to avoid any further interaction with this property. The 3 artifacts that had already been removed for examination mysteriously disappeared from the property company's storage facility the night following Morrison's death, with the night watchman's log containing a single cryptic entry, Shadows moved against the direction of the lamplight, and there came a whispering in no language I have ever heard. The former Beauregard plantation house passed through numerous owners after Cornelius abandoned it in 1859, eventually falling into the hands of industrialist Howard Thornton, who in 1921 commissioned extensive renovations to transform the decaying antebellum structure into a modern summer residence. According to contractor records preserved in the Baton Rouge Historical Society archives, it was during the removal of a wall between the library and what had once been Elijah Beauregard's private study that carpenter Joseph Martin discovered a hidden cavity containing a small oilcloth-wrapped package. The contents, 3 leather-bound volumes written in a precise, educated hand, were initially overlooked until Thornton's wife Elizabeth, a history enthusiast, recognized their potential significance and contacted Professor Emmett Clark at Louisiana State University. Clark's initial analysis, documented in his correspondence with the Smithsonian Institution, confirmed the journal's authenticity through handwriting comparison with known samples of plantation correspondence, identifying the author as Lucinda Williams, who had purchased her freedom in 1863 and remained in Baton Rouge until her death in 1897. The earliest entries, dating from 1855, revealed Lucinda's unique position within the household as both servant and reluctant confidant to Elijah Beauregard's increasingly disturbing activities. Master has begun another ritual tonight, the 4th this month. Requiring blood from Isaiah's arm mixed with herbs I am instructed to gather under the dark moon. More explicit passages describe ceremonies conducted in the slave cemetery on the plantation's northern boundary, where Beauregard allegedly formed a circle with specific enslaved individuals chosen for what Lucinda recorded as qualities beyond their physical forms, elements of their spirits that Master says make them suitable vessels for the crossing. The most shocking revelation came in entries from early 1858, where Lucinda detailed Beauregard's promise to Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth that, through the final ritual, they would attain freedom no earthly liberator could provide. Freedom not just from bondage of the body but from all constraints of mortality itself, requiring only their willing participation in the blood sacrifice that would open the pathway between worlds. Clark's analysis ended abruptly after his initial reading of the 2nd volume. His final notation to the Smithsonian ominously stating that certain passages suggest knowledge no human should possess, before he withdrew from public life entirely, the remaining diary content sealed by university trustees until 1972. The existence of Celeste Beauregard remained largely unknown to Beauregard scholars until 1962. When the Archdiocese of Boston unsealed ecclesiastical records revealing the final confession of Cornelius Beauregard's widow to Father Michael Sullivan on the 18th of September 1887, hours before her death from consumption. The transcript, preserved due to Father Sullivan's concern that it documented events beyond the realm of ordinary sin and into territories the Church might need to address directly, recounts Celeste's 27-year marriage to a man increasingly consumed by terror following their hasty departure from Louisiana in November 1858. My husband fled his inheritance not from moral objection to slavery, as he allowed Boston society to believe, Celeste testified, but from fear of what he called the arrangement that survived Uncle Elijah's death, a contract written in blood that listed him as alternate signatory should the principal debtor default. According to her testimony, Cornelius awoke screaming nearly every night during their first year of marriage, describing dreams in which Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth stood at the foot of his bed, their forms human, yet somehow more, eyes reflecting light that had no source in our world, mouths moving in synchrony as they reminded him the bargain remained in effect. Celeste detailed the elaborate precautions Cornelius maintained, thresholds lined with salt and iron filings, windows painted with symbols matching those found in Elijah's grave, and the monthly ritual Cornelius performed without fail, the sacrifice of 3 white doves, their blood collected in a silver bowl inscribed with letters that seemed to shift when viewed directly, and poured onto soil transported from Magnolia Hill in sealed containers. Father Sullivan's addendum notes that following Celeste's death, he visited their Boston home and discovered Cornelius's body in his study, the walls covered in symbols described in Lucinda's diary, his expression frozen in what the priest could only describe as recognition of something long anticipated finally manifesting before him. Dr. Eleanor Washington, a tenured professor of African American history at Howard University, encountered the Beauregard case initially as a footnote in her broader research on literacy among enslaved populations, never anticipating it would consume the next decade of her scholarly career. The turning point in her investigation came during a summer 1978 research fellowship at the Louisiana State Archives, where she discovered an anomalous entry in St. James Parish birth records from 1832, a notation regarding an unnamed female infant born to house servant Catherine, property of François Beauregard, with unusual marginalia in François' handwriting indicating child to remain at main house. Special consideration to be given. Washington's subsequent analysis of plantation medical records revealed payments to a midwife specifically retained for Catherine's delivery and, more significantly, physician notations documenting physical characteristics suggesting paternal heredity, a euphemism commonly employed when enslaved women bore children fathered by white plantation owners. The most compelling evidence emerged when Washington compared Lucinda's handwriting from her discovered journals with samples of Elijah Beauregard's correspondence, identifying 15 distinct matching characteristics that graphology experts confirmed indicated familial connection or extraordinary mimicry through prolonged intimate exposure. Washington's landmark paper, published in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies in 1981, methodically established that Lucinda Williams was almost certainly Elijah Beauregard's half-sister or, more likely given the age difference, his unacknowledged daughter. A conclusion that contextualized her unprecedented access to education, household privilege, and involvement in Beauregard's most private affairs. Far from being merely a domestic servant, Washington wrote, Lucinda occupied a liminal space within the plantation hierarchy, simultaneously family yet property, confidant yet captive, record-keeper yet herself a carefully managed asset. This revelation transformed scholarly interpretation of Lucinda's diaries, suggesting her documentation of rituals and disappearances represented not merely the observations of a household servant, but the perspective of someone with profound personal stakes in the Beauregard legacy, someone who, in Washington's assessment, recognized in Elijah's dealings with Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth, not just the supernatural transactions described in her writings, but a potential parallel to her own ambiguous position as both Beauregard blood and Beauregard chattel, navigating the treacherous boundary between two worlds. The final volume of Lucinda's diary, unsealed by Louisiana State University trustees in 1972 after 50 years of restricted access, contained entries from the weeks immediately preceding the disappearances that historian Robert Jefferson described as so disturbing in their implications that they reshape our understanding not just of the Beauregard case, but of how enslaved Africans may have utilized spiritual traditions as weapons against their oppressors. The entries, written in increasingly agitated handwriting, detail how Elijah had approached Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth individually in 1857, offering them freedom beyond the earthly realm through rituals derived from what Lucinda identified as practices brought from Dahomey and preserved in secret for generations. According to Lucinda's account, dated the 23rd of May 1858, Master has completed the 7th preparation ritual with them tonight, marking their bodies with symbols I am forbidden to transcribe, speaking of powers that will transform them into beings beyond human constraint once the final sacrifice opens the doorway. Most significant was her June 9th entry, which revealed that the culminating ritual required Elijah's willing self-sacrifice, his death serving as the catalyst for whatever transformation he had promised the 3 enslaved participants. He speaks of transcendence for them all, claiming his blood freely given will unlock a power that allows passage between worlds, his spirit and theirs, united in some existence beyond our comprehension. The fatal corruption of the pact, according to Lucinda's final entry on June 11th, came when Elijah revealed his true intention. Tonight I witnessed true horror as Master brought forth a bound stranger, a traveler captured on the northern road, announcing to the assembled three that this substitute would fulfill the blood requirement in his destined place. Solomon's face transformed with fury. Isaiah began chanting in their ancestral tongue, and Ruth, my God. Ruth's eyes reflected something beyond human as Master's duplicity was revealed. The diary ends abruptly mid-sentence, with forensic analysis of the paper indicating the final page was torn away, leaving the exact nature of what transpired that night to be inferred only through the evidence of 3 missing persons and Elijah Beauregard's mutilated corpse discovered 3 days later. The deteriorating Beauregard family papers, acquired by Louisiana State University's Special Collections in 2014, contained a hand-drawn map bearing markings inconsistent with any known plantation survey, prompting archaeologist Dr. Marissa Fontenot to secure funding for the first comprehensive examination of the former Magnolia Hill property using 21st-century technology. The 3-week investigation, conducted in February 2015 under the auspices of the Southern Historical Preservation Society, employed ground-penetrating radar that revealed anomalies precisely where Lucinda's diary had described the northern ritual grounds, a section of the property approximately half a mile from the main house. Site, adjacent to but distinct from the documented slave cemetery. Excavation permits, initially contested by descendants of subsequent property owners but ultimately granted through court order, allowed Fontenot's team to uncover what her preliminary report described as 7 burial sites, arranged in a perfect heptagonal pattern, each containing remains interred without coffins, but surrounded by artifacts inconsistent with both traditional Christian and known West African burial practices. Forensic anthropologist Dr. James Winters documented that each skeleton bore unusual modifications: incisions in the cranium, long bones inscribed with symbols matching those in Lucinda's diary, and most significantly, evidence suggesting the individuals had not died of natural causes but through precisely inflicted trauma. Carbon dating placed the remains between 1859 and 1861. The period immediately following Cornelius Beauregard's hasty departure from Louisiana, while recovered personal effects, jewelry, clothing fragments, and in one case, a monogrammed pocket watch, suggested the deceased were not enslaved individuals but persons of social standing. The investigation's most disturbing finding emerged when DNA extracted from bone samples was compared against genetic material voluntarily provided by Beauregard descendants participating in the university's Southern lineage project. 5 of the 7 skeletal remains shared genetic markers with modern Beauregard family members. Despite historical records documenting these individuals, business associates, and distant relatives of Cornelius, as having died in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia between 1862 and 1870, their deaths officially attributed to consumption, heart failure, or in one case, accidental drowning. The most recent development in the Beauregard mystery emerged in January 2023, when archivist Teresa Mouton discovered a sealed letter while digitizing miscellaneous 19th-century correspondence in the Louisiana State Archives' unclaimed mail collection, addressed to Emmanuel Lafayette, a free man of color residing in New Orleans' Treme neighborhood. The letter's authenticity was confirmed through handwriting analysis matching it to the only known sample of Solomon's writing, a carpenter's invoice preserved in Magnolia Hill's financial records. The contents, severely damaged by moisture and time, have been only partially reconstructed through advanced imaging techniques, with legible fragments offering tantalizing glimpses rather than definitive answers. Freedom through darker paths than those who travel north by stars. Beauregard's bargain offered transformation beyond mere liberty. Isaiah and Ruth have completed their transition while I remain between. Spirits of ancestors spoke true when they promised power would flow from master to vessel. A price willingly paid, though not by the one who made the covenant. What emerges after sacrifice bears our faces, but exists beyond the constraints of flesh. We return when the moon aligns to collect what remains of the bloodline. Tell our kin we have not abandoned them but serve from beyond. These cryptic fragments, neither confirming nor refuting supernatural explanations, exemplify the fundamental enigma that has characterized the Beauregard case across 16 decades of investigation. The disappearance of 3 enslaved individuals, the mysterious death of their master, the strategic elimination of Beauregard descendants, the curious physical evidence defying conventional explanation, all can be interpreted through either rational historical lens as a sophisticated revenge plot employing psychological manipulation and deliberate mythologizing to terrorize oppressors, or through acknowledgement of possibilities beyond current understanding as evidence that spiritual practices preserved from West Africa accessed powers outside European comprehension. Perhaps the true legacy of Magnolia Hill lies precisely in this unresolvable tension, this refusal to conform to simplistic explanation, challenging us to recognize the limitations of historical certainty and suggesting that within the darkest chapters of American history, some truths remain elusive, witnessed only by those who, like Solomon, Isaiah, and Ruth, chose freedom through paths unrecorded by conventional history, their final testimony written not in documents we can archive but in consequences that continue to reverberate through generations of those who followed.